Welcome everyone to our workshop, How to Publish a Journal Article with the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History. I'm Tom Cleveland, the Academic Programs Officer at the Jack Miller Center, and we're going to be joined today by Jeremy Bailey and Susan McWilliams, who are co-editors of American Political Thought and the American Political Thought book series at the University Press of Kansas. Before we get started in earnest, I'm just going to say a few things about the format of this workshop today. You all are going to be on mute throughout, so you can do whatever you wish and we won't know about it. If you want to participate, and we really do want you to participate, that's what makes this a worthwhile event, use the Q&A box to submit questions and submit them as early as you wish. The earlier you send them, the more likely we'll be able to get to them. We have some polls, so you can answer those at the opening and at the closing. And I think we have the chat box functioning, so if you just want to talk amongst yourselves, go ahead and do that there. But if you want me to relay a question to them, make sure you put it in the Q&A box. Now I'm going to make a proper introduction to our panelists today. So Jeremy Bailey is professor at the University of Houston, where he holds a dual appointment in political science in the Honors College. His books include The Idea of Presidential Representation, An Intellectual and Political History, James Madison and Constitutional Imperfection, The Contested Removal Power, 1789 to 2010, and Thomas Jefferson and Executive Power. Susan McWilliams is chair and professor of politics at Pomona College. She's the author of The American Road Trip and American Political Thought and Traveling Back Toward a Global Political Theory. She's edited several books, including A Political Companion to James Baldwin and The Best Kind of College, an Insider's Guide to America's Small Liberal Arts College. But the main reason we have them here today is because, as I mentioned, they're editors of American Political Thought, a journal of ideas, institutions, and culture, published quarterly by the University of Chicago Press and supported by the Jack Miller Center, as well as the American Political Thought book series at the University Press of Kansas. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Tom. We're really glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks to the Jack Miller Center for doing this.
Yep. So I'm just going to begin right where I left off, and I just want to ask you what your vision, or well, you can just say, what is the Journal of American Political Thought, and what's your vision for it in the future? What's its purpose? What niche does it fulfill that isn't fulfilled by other journals? And I guess I would say have the same question about the American Political Thought series at the University of Kansas.
Well, before I answer part of that question, I want to say thank you to everybody who's joining us today. And I want to echo Jeremy's thanks to Jack Miller and the Jack Miller Center, which has been broadly supportive of this journal from its very beginning several years ago. Jeremy and I became the editors of American Political Thought a little over a year ago for a 4-year term of editing the journal. And the journal had been very capably edited prior to that point by Michael Zuckert and a team of people at the University of Notre Dame. And Zuckert, as the founding editor of the journal, gave us so much to work with in that he really established the journal as the premier source of conversation in American political thought, both in this country and beyond. Jeremy and I, when we became editors of this journal, wanted to capitalize on everything that Michael and the previous editorial team had done in both maintaining the journal's standards for excellence in scholarship in American political thought, and even trying to increase the visibility and legitimacy of the journal in the profession. For us, that means basically, we have basically two priorities when it comes to the journal, and Jeremy can put his own spin on this if he has a slightly different one. Our first priority is to really seek out excellent scholarship in American political thought. And excellent scholarship in American political thought, so that this is the go-to place for people who are interested in the field of American political thought. Our second major priority is to extend the range of the journal, extend the visibility of the journal. This is a fairly young journal compared to some of the other journals that are out there. And we want to do that, first of all, by making sure that we're hitting all the different academic disciplines in which people do work in American political thought. The journal, when we inherited it, was very well known among political scientists, a little less well known among historians. So we've tried to make a lot of outreach to historians in the last year. But of course, there are also lots of other academic disciplines in which people do work that can be classified under the heading of academic political thought. So we really want to extend the disciplinary range of the journal. And we also want to extend the range of authors and readers of the journal more broadly, not just into different fields, but into different conversations. Jeremy and I are really excited. We agree that American political thought is at a very exciting moment. There's lots of new energy in the field. There's lots of attention to new thinkers, new moments in history. And we really want to capture that in our editorship of the journal.
Yeah, let me add to that. I agree. I think that's really captures it all. I want to make a plug for the book series in a second. On those two things, let me just state it very quickly this way. We absolutely want the journal to be a place where scholars seeking first a job and then promotion and tenure will feel assured that this will be a journal that will be respected in their file. And so maintaining the scholarly credentials of the journal is very important to us, as is increasing the diversity in the submissions and the reviewers in terms of both maybe the time period of study, but also maybe the substantive question involved. So on the book series, this is going to be a conversation about journal publishing, but let's make a plug for the book series really quickly. Susan and I are really excited to be working with the University Press of Kansas in the American Political Thought book series. For those of you who don't know it, it's an excellent series. It was started in the early 90s by Wilson Carey McWilliams and by Lance Banning, a political theorist and a historian. It has about over 80 volumes in the series, and there's some really good authors in that series. So we're very excited about that. The book series is alive and well and will continue forward into the future.
Yes, thanks for that. Now, at this point, I want to broaden the conversation a bit just to the process of how articles get published. And among the first things an author has to consider, I think, is what the right venue for their article is. Right. So as you were saying, American political thought has a very specific aim, publishing a certain kind of work among various disciplines, but not everyone's article is going to fit there. How does an author think about finding the right venue for their work?
I think Jeremy tends to be a little better at answering these kinds of questions than I am. So I'll mostly defer to him on this one. But I would say the greatest piece of advice I could offer is to do your homework, to read the journals in question and see where you feel like your article is likely to be a fit. Because the first reason a journal editor could turn you down is because there's a perception that there's not fit with the journal. The other thing that I would say is you should also be aware of whatever your home institution's requirements are or expectations are in terms of journal publishing. I'll leave it at that. I'll turn this one over mostly to Jeremy.
Yeah, okay, so first of all, our quick formula that we inherited from Michael Zuckert: is it American, is it political, and is it thought? When we find ourselves in gray areas with fit, we come back to that shorthand. But let me say something about the perspective of the author here. And I think the main thing to ask, the author should ask themselves is do I have an article that makes one contribution or two contributions? If it's one contribution, you're going to be in a subfield journal. And if it's two contributions, then you might be thinking about maybe something with a wider audience than a subfield journal. So I'm thinking the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, and so forth. Where there, you are probably going to make some sort of interpretive claim, as well as some sort of conceptual claim, both of which are going to be of interest. If your article doesn't have that, and let's face it, most articles do not have that. It's a very difficult thing to do. And that's also true of the empirical people as well. They have to make two contributions as well. If you don't have two contributions, you're thinking about which is my subfield journal that's a fit for here. And for most people, you're going to have one or two journals that's going to be your primary area. And there might be one that you would like to get in, but most of your stuff doesn't fit. I've got one of those in my own email box right now. I'm trying to get into a journal that is outside my usual area. And that's how I would think about it. And if you're a first-time author, I would say you probably don't want to burn your bridge at the journal that you think this might have a shot of landing in first. I would try somewhere out first before then to see what their viewers are seeming like they're like. So maybe aim maybe a little higher than you should for that one, and then you can get it for that second submission to the journal that you think is the realistic target for.
Can I get you or either of you to expand a little bit on what you meant by two contributions? I think the way you summarized it was an interpretive claim and a conceptual claim, or is there other ways to think about it?
Yeah, for let's say for a quantitative political scientist, to get in the AJPS, what they're going to have to do is use some sort of new data with probably a new method to make a new theory that's going to change the way that people think about a certain thing. Call it descriptive representation. And in political theory, I think there's a similar thing. So if you have a really cool interpretation of, say, Adam Smith, that's going to be of interest to Smith scholars, and maybe it's going to be of interest to early modern scholars, that's going to be great for the review of politics or history of political thought. That may not get you into the Journal of Politics. You probably want to have some sort of contribution with respect to something bigger than Smith, some sort of larger concept, which means that you're going to have to sell your topic a little bit. And let's face it, that can be a little cheesy or sometimes even a little trashy to sell your topic that way, and it feels that way. And so that's why not every piece you have is appropriate for it.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that Jeremy and I have seen a lot is that a lot of people, I think, have gotten the advice with those, bigger journals in mind to try to claim contemporary relevance, almost no matter what it is that they're writing about, right? So here's a thing that Walt Whitman said in Democratic Vistas, and it's been misinterpreted by other scholars. The conclusion is, in this age of social media, X, right? And a lot of times those kinds of contemporary tie-ins, which I think people are encouraged to do to pitch to those journals that want, as Jeremy said, want the articles to speak more broadly than to the narrow audience of people who are interested in what Walt Whitman said in Democratic Vistas. But a lot of times, most of the time, I think they don't really work. If your article is a kind of subfield, it's narrow, it's within a small community of scholars, and you should be careful, I think, about trying to make those big kind of contemporary claims. And I like the way that Jeremy thinks about it. Be honest with yourself about the scope of your article, and don't try to, stretch it to make it seem bigger than it is. Just try to pitch it to the right journal, and think about what journal it would be a good fit for.
Thank you. At this point, I want to get a little into the nitty-gritty of what happens to get an article published. So let's say I've done my homework, as you said. I found a journal, maybe it's your journal, and I think it's a good fit. I send it in. what happens then? Who's the first person to see it? What kind of decisions are made? What's the process? Because I think that'll help people. It could help people think about what it is they're getting into.
Well, I would say this is a little different at every journal, out there. In our case, because Jeremy and I are co-editors, we can collectively take on some of the work that I think at other journals is beyond the capacity of a single editor to do. But the first things I think that anybody is going to look at when they get a journal article is, has this person paid attention to the submission requirements that are on the website for the journal? Are the footnotes and the notes formatted in more or less the right way? Is it more or less the right length? A lot of times pieces will be desk reject because they're either twice the recommended length or half the recommended length. So really make sure that you've paid attention to all of those submission instructions, because you don't want to give editors an easy no. The other thing that people will look at right away is to make sure that the prose is legible. It seems like, I think a lot of people leave some of that kind of stylistic editing and assume that will take place at the copy editing stage. But again, you don't want to give as editors an easy no by saying, look, this is just not, the writing is just not up to the standards of our journal. So those are the first things that any journal is going to look at before they really officially put it into the review process. And maybe Jeremy, you can take it from there.
Yeah, I would say the next thing would be the decision to assign an editor. And in that case, that's made together by Susan and I. And so if there's something that's a clear fit for either one of us, we'll say, here, I'll take that one, or you take that one. And we'll pay attention also to maybe questions of workload. And so we assign an editor. And once the editor is assigned, the editor will be responsible for selecting the external reviewers. We can say something about that in a second, but we'll usually consult to some extent about who we might think readers might be. That's assuming it's going to go out, but I think we're getting to the next questions.
Right. So, I mean, if I send something in and let's say you reject it, is that the end of the story, or there's possibility of me resubmitting with advice from you all?
Right. Well, I think it depends. I know that one of the things that's important to both me and to Jeremy is that we do try to help people make the best case for themselves. So sometimes it's the case that we'll reject something and say, listen, before this is really ready for us to send out, you would have to do either X, Y, or Z, and probably some combination of thereof. We could send this out now, but we don't think it would do very well, so we're sort of sending it back to you. There are other cases, though, where I think, I should have said, to follow up on what Jeremy said earlier, one of the first things we do look at is fit for the journal. So sometimes we write back to people and say, we're rejecting this right off the bat because it's not sufficiently focused on the political, or the thought. So I would say if you get a kind of rejection, fairly shortly after you've submitted an article, check very carefully to see what the editor says. We do spend time on each of those letters that we send back to people, and we will try to give you as helpful information as possible. And that will include a signal about whether we think that this is something that could be resubmitted in another form in the future. But usually if you're getting rejected at that point, we're saying at minimum, you're going to have to do some major rewriting, right, reconception before you try it again.
I would just add that we've had I think a vigorous reject and resubmit pattern going on for the last year. Not all of that is what seem to be younger scholars, but a good bit of it is. I would say that usually in that case, there is a positive line. There's something positive there, and that is that we don't think it should just be a reject. Mm-hmm. So we see there's some potential, and usually, again, you'll hear us say this over and over again, what's missing is a clear sense of the scholarly contribution. And so we're trying to force the author to say that, so that it has a better chance of surviving the external reviews. Because external reviewers will just whack it and not do anything with it if it doesn't, try to make a contribution the first time around. So we're trying to give the authors a chance to think about how they're going to pitch it to reviewers.
Well, maybe we should move on then to the positive. Let's say you've made the decision, it should go out to reviewers. What's that process like? And I mean, I know in some journals, they even ask you who you think should look at it or who you think shouldn't look at it. Is that, how should an author think about that whole process?
I say do include names on the grounds that it usually can't hurt. Now, there are some indications where it can hurt, and maybe people haven't gotten this memo, but please do not submit the names of your graduate advisor or people in your home department as people who should review this, or somebody who's clearly in, your friend or your co-author.
Right.
Because those things are usually fairly transparent.
What are the lines? What are the lines there, though? Because if you're working on a certain topic, it's likely the other people working on that topic.
Oh, knowing
some sort of relationship with them. What's the?
Knowing somebody's perfectly fine, because I mean the principle of arm's length is it helps here, and that is that during external review, which is blind, you can give your friend really tough advice. If somebody that you've gotten to know over conferences, maybe even had beers with, whatnot, that's totally legitimate. And we're not interested in who's having beers with who. Nobody is. It would be more of a professional connection. If somebody's professional reputation, right, something to gain from your doing so. Now, as far as what we'll do is we'll chat reviewers. And Susan, you want to say more?
Well, I think that I agree with Jeremy. It never hurts to submit some suggestions. Usually we go to those suggestions when, let's say, there's an article about, I don't know, the work of Kurt Vonnegut. And in the situation where Jeremy and I aren't really sure we know the best people, we'll certainly take a look at the list of people that the author suggests. But for the most part, I think in our own process, we discuss it back and forth. And I would say some of the things that we're thinking about is that we look at the article and say, okay, especially given that we aspire to interdisciplinarity within the journal. Okay, well, we'll need, this is, let's say, an article about so-and-so's positions during the Reconstruction era, right? So let's think about who would be historians who would know about the Reconstruction era. Let's think about political theorists who might be thinking about that same period of time. Now let's look at the actual author who's being talked about and think about who else has done work on that particular author. So we're trying to get in those three reviewers a kind of representative range of the kind of people who we think would read your article if it were published in the journal. Which is to say, I think that you should try not to write for an audience of one. You should be mindful of the fact that we are going to try to send it out to a variety of people, both because that's good for the journal, but I also think, and I've seen this play out quite a few times now, it's really good for authors. If we were to send an article to three, Thoreau scholars on a Thoreau article, all those three Thoreau scholars are going to come back often with saying, oh, have you considered this book? Have you considered this book? And you've considered that book. But if we're expanding the range of authors, we can get sort of more different kinds of helpful advice for the author in question. So that's something that you can think about too in terms of suggesting reviewers. What are the community of scholars that you really think that you could be targeting with this article?
Yeah, let me add to that. If there's something that's clearly within a certain scholarly tradition, let's call it a natural law tradition, or let's call it a particular school of race, class, and gender, or something, you might get two out of your three reviewers from within that camp, so to speak. But we're going to work really hard to make sure there's a third outside of that camp. Maybe somebody from our editorial board. We'd like to have somebody from our board, at least one on every article, but that's really hard, actually, it turns out. But anyway, so you can expect to see some sort of attempt at replicating the expertise, but some sort of diversity in terms of the reviewer.
That's right.
And so let's say it's been sent out and you've gotten reviews back. The reviewers have sent their review of it. How do you manage that process? Or could you just talk a little bit about that?
Our process has been that usually what happens is Jeremy and I will probably both re-look at the article once the reviews come in, and then read the reviews and then have a conversation. Have a conversation about which of the reviews is the, not just the conversation about what decision to make, but which of the reviews are most helpful, what's our own sense of what needs to be done. Because often it's in a kind of triangulation of the 3 reviews that it becomes clear to me and or Jeremy, what's the thing, what's the 1 or 2 things that you could do that would address the maximum number of concerns. And so we have that conversation, and we try to, one of the things that I should say here is we try to have that conversation as soon as possible. I think one of the things that is really important to both of us, mindful of the fact that people are submitting things and that their tenures and their promotions depend upon it. We really do try to do that. I would say within a week of getting the 3rd review every time. So we try to turn it around as quickly as possible with those kinds of things in mind. And when we're writing a letter, we really are trying to not just say, look at the reviews below, but you can look at the reviews below. Here's the ones that we think you should pay most attention to. Here are some points raised by the reviewers that we think probably, that we don't agree with. Sometimes we say that, but putting this all together, here are the, 2 or 3 things that we think that you would have to do before you could resubmit it, assuming a revise and resubmit.
Right, because it could be the case that there's all sorts of suggestions.
Right. Of course, it could
be.
Yeah.
And it's not appropriate to try to satisfy everyone.
Right.
So.
On the timing, let me just mention our touch points really are about a week, both on the entry stage and on the decision stage. Our decision, our form invitation is basically 40 days for most reviewers. So a reviewer will have 40 days. And so where we lose a little bit of time is on the back end of the reviewers, as you might expect, but where the really hidden delays is the waiting for the reviewer to say yes. And so if you're out there, say yes to those reviews or say no to those reviews immediately, please.
Yes, just make the decision right away. That's hard to track people down.
Don't feel bad about a no, but feel bad about delaying and then saying no. Anyway, so that's where we get a little bit of the hang up, is waiting for the straggler 3rd reviewer, basically.
And I mean, so I had actually a question from email I could introduce at this point that's apropos. Someone asked the question, what should an author do if an unfavorable reader's report contains 1 or more errors?
You should point it out.
It sounds like a question coming from some very personal experience.
You should, when you respond to a reader with your revision, assuming that you revise and resubmit, your letter should address all the things that you're going to do, and your letter should say all the things you're not going to do, and presumably you're not going to fix something because the suggestion was made in error. Now, let's imagine it's a rejection. My advice would be to wait a couple of days and just say, by the way, thanks for your time, but you might be interested to know that this reviewer made an error.
Yeah, I would say too, one of the things that I really didn't appreciate especially when I was a junior scholar and submitting things to journals, is that there are humans on the other end of the process. In the situation where, let's say you get a revise and resubmit, and we haven't picked up on one of the errors in the reviews, you should feel free to write to the editors of the journal at that point and say, I do want to revise this for resubmission, but I think there's an error here. Can we talk about that before I do all of this fixing? That is, I agree with Jeremy that in that final letter, when you do revise, you should say exactly, right, like why you're not doing it for the purposes of this being sent out to subsequent reviewers, but you shouldn't be afraid to have a back and forth with the editor at that point. I think, and that's part of another thing that I don't think I realized as a junior scholar is that in every article that we get that we put through revise and, we put through the review process, we want that article to do well. We want that article to become the author to have the best chance to show their work. We want the article to become the best version of itself. And so if a little back and forth conversation with the editor, outside the formal, editorial manager emails would help you clarify some important points there, I think any journal editor would be really happy to have that kind of, it's not off the record, but sort of outside editorial manager kind of conversation.
Have you either of you done that yourself? You've had that experience from the author's point of view?
I could think of one where an author had a particular concern. In this case, it was more like a grumpy reviewer or an unreasonably grumpy reviewer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had those, and part of what I've noticed is it's usually people who are already tenured who will write back and say, oh, what's going on with this review? Here's what I think, right? Can I do this in response? And so that's why I'm especially saying to people who are graduate students and not tenured out there, you should feel entitled to that level of entitlement, because if you're confused about something in a review, or if you think that something in a review is wrong, that's something that we'd certainly be willing to have a conversation about for everybody's benefit.
I'm going to start turning to questions in a moment, but is there anything else about the process itself you think you ought to get out there before we?
Yeah, I
Go
just
ahead.
thought of something, and that is some people might be familiar with the way that Catherine Zucker used to run Review of Politics, which I've experienced with positively and negatively. And that is, she was very clear that the revisions went to a new set of reviewers. We are not doing that. In the usual cases, the revised article will go back to the same set, unless there's an especially grumpy reviewer who didn't seem to be willing, and usually they'll say they're not willing to review it in the second round.
Mm-hmm. Or if they really fundamentally misunderstood the article in a way that seems obvious to us. You will usually tell people if that's the case, right? We recently had an article where I said, look, there are two people who are sort of grumpy about this, but we're going to send it. We want to let you know if you revise, we'll send it out to some other reviewers to see what they say about it. So yeah, we don't always send it to the same people, but that is usually our default setting.
Great. I'm going to relay to you some of the questions we've received so far, and I want to encourage everyone watching to send in a question, however elementary it may seem. I think we've got a lot of graduate students and early career people in here, and this is how you start learning about this stuff. So please send in any question you may have. We have a question here. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on the peer review process? To what extent has the process slowed down? Any advice to authors? Any effect, or not so much? Maybe people are home and.
I personally felt like it was harder to get reviewers to be responsive, and then so I felt like reviewers were slow. I also, this is maybe just the data is too small, but I feel like tenured scholars were a little slow on maybe revisions. Younger scholars are hungry and want to get it out there, but it certainly slowed down. Tenured reviewers got slower after the pandemic.
Yeah, I would add, I do think it's true that we are seeing fewer things from female authors. That is being reported across journals in all disciplines, that there is a gendered dimension to submissions at this point in time. But I think,
because of childcare?
I assume because of childcare responsibilities,
the way that,
and caregiving responsibilities more generally. So I think that is happening. What seems to me the case is that at different moments, I felt like there's a slowdown. Sometimes I felt like there's actually an uptick in the number of people. But really what I think it's done is made our normal calendar a little less predictable. Normally it's the case that you get big surges of journal articles in the summer, and that we didn't have the kind of moment of big surge this summer. I think things were coming in a little bit more, unpredictably.
Right. A lot of people do their research or finish up an article on the break, but they might not have had that time this year.
Right. And I think some people have more time. So,
Yeah,
I
right.
think
Yeah, it depends.
I don't want to make too many generalizations, but I agree with Jeremy that if you get review requests, the best thing you can do for everybody is, if you want to say no, just say no quickly. That really is the thing that can help us the most.
I'm just going to read this question verbatim. As editors, do you know of areas and topics in American political thought that have not received enough attention and could be more attractive to journals today? Do you advise graduate students to work on those areas to have better chance to get published, or on their interests that might have been heavily covered and difficult to contribute to? So anything you want to say about that?
We're getting a lot of stuff on race, on Reconstruction, on Frederick Douglass. We're getting a lot of stuff, and this is, I think, a continuation on Tocqueville. And so Tocqueville, in a way, might be the leading subject of the journal in terms of submissions and articles. I wonder.
Is he American? He's political in thought, but it's in the title.
We've counted him because he's counted. Anyway, yes, Tocqueville counts. I would hesitate in trying to nudge people in a particular direction right now, because I feel like anything I suggest would in a way be behind the curve, and people are probably already there. Younger scholars are doing really cool stuff, and I wouldn't want to try to nudge it.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that trying to, especially if you're talking about a big research agenda, I think that trying to game it based on what you think there's demand for right now can so often blow up in your face, because what's in demand right now sometimes isn't in demand 2 years from now. And better to do something that you're passionate about, that you want to stare at in the reflection of your screen for the next several years, than to try to get inside the heads of some kind of like amorphous they that's out there. And I agree with Jeremy, pretty much everything that you can think of that, might be cutting edge or avant-garde, there are probably already people who are working on it and thinking about it. And so even if it's not quite evident, so you shouldn't do it unless you really want to do it. That said, there are lots of areas in American political thought where I know that Jeremy and I would love to see submissions. I will give one example, and don't take it as a nudge, right? There's very little published in Chicano political thought. There's almost none. And yet those conversations are out there in different disciplines and in different parts of the country. And so, I will get excited if I see something in that area that's a good article that's going to be sort of helping to expand the range of what the journal does. But again, I wouldn't go seek those things out unless they're there. I agree with Jeremy. We also get a lot of stuff on Jefferson still, I think, because Jefferson has a lot of race tie-in. We do get a lot of, because we get a lot of stuff on race right now, I do want to say, if you're not somebody who's really familiar with that, like sort of the literature on race and politics, you should be careful again about making too many claims that say, tie the author you're really talking about to Black Lives Matter, right? Like that, those can be kind of dangerous leaps that people make. So if you're going to try to,
It's
Right.
simple, yeah.
Right. Understanding that a lot of people are interested in conversations about race and politics right now. Do make sure that you've read that literature as well as whatever literature you're sort of more familiar. If you're trying to extend your range, by all means, try to extend your range. But one thing that we haven't said that Jeremy did allude to is that the number one reason that reviewers recommend that we turn down pieces is because the author does not demonstrate familiarity with the literature, right? It's a really easy thing for reviewers to do, which is to say, you don't mention the following 10 books, which are canonical in the field. Therefore, I can't trust that anything you say really has relevance to the scholarly conversation. So really make sure that you are aware of, especially recent work in the field. A lot of times it's scholars saying, this person acts as if this scholarship ended in the year 2002, and they don't reference anything past 2002. Right, so make sure that whatever you're doing, that you do know what the conversation is out there. That doesn't mean that you have to blather on at length at the beginning of, right, accounting for all of these things, but your footnotes, your engagement should reflect that you're aware of the major interpretive positions that have been taken, especially in the last few years.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I went to Boston College. At BC, they didn't make us read secondary literature. They just didn't. And so it was something that I had to learn a little bit later. And the great thing is it's not hard. And there's almost 2 or 3 schools of thought on any interpretive question. And so you can very quickly figure out how your reading of a text matters within the confines of an interpretive debate that's already been happening.
Yeah, I think that's probably good advice for, I mean, a lot of the people in the Jack Miller Center Network are political theorists by training, and among certain schools of political theorists, I went to Boston College as well. It's secondary literature is not encouraged, but if you want to make your way, you probably should familiarize yourself.
Yeah, and just assume that there's an interpretive debate that started happening, at least a couple decades ago, and you want to join that conversation, and the contribution will be your ability to demonstrate that you can join that conversation and you have new evidence to provide to it.
Here's a direct question. What percentage of your submissions end up in print?
I saw that in the queue and I've been thinking about it. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but just quickly, so we've done 4 issues. So that's just say 20 articles. I doubt we've issued 80 rejections. But it's probably somewhere in the ballpark of that. But so it's that rate must therefore be somewhat above 20%. Let me add here that what I've learned in this process is, number one, I am not the meanest reviewer out there. There are, on a scale of 1 to 10 of meanness, I'm about a 7 or 8. I just assumed I was a 10, but there are definitely meaner reviewers than I am. And that is to say that peer review is hard. Peer-reviewed articles are hard. In a way, books are easier because you can get away with more. But an article, it's so much, the demand for parsimony is just so great, and the reviewers are so tough. And so don't think that because this is a subfield journal that's somehow easier. In a way, it's just as hard because you got to get through 3 reviewers.
Anything to add, Susan?
No, I agree with that 100%. It is, and we have, very in part because people, I think, for all sorts of reasons, care very deeply and feel that there are great stakes in any conversation that involves American political thought. That's of course true.
Right.
And so I do think we get reviewers who are not just very good at knowing the literature and being part of that conversation and knowing, where there are, what are contributions and what are not contributions to literature, but who also have this sense of wanting the journal to only, the sense of investment in the whole subfield of American political thought and American politics.
Here's another question. In general help books on publishing, one can find advice suggesting that junior authors send out letters of inquiry to journals, pitching their topic and testing the journal's interest. Is this common or appropriate at APT or in the discipline more broadly?
Let's
I would say it's common. What would you say, Jeremy?
I was going to say, if you're confused about whether or not something meets the standard of American political or thought. So if you're an historian and you're not doing clear intellectual history, but you want to know if this is going to be of interest, maybe that would be a good opportunity. We've had some hard calls where we've had, say, work on walls. That seem to be what we call Rawlsian, not necessarily historicizing Rawls in the 20th century or something like that, but more just standard Rawlsian applications of a puzzle. And we tell those people to submit elsewhere. That's what we've just started to figure out. But if you had questions like that, that would be, I think, an opportunity to ask the journal.
It wouldn't be inappropriate just to send an email prior to, I think that's what they said.
Yeah, I think what I hear Jeremy saying, what I agree with, is if you're really concerned that there might not be a fit, like I've written this article critiquing somebody's interpretation of Rawls, is that right? We would certainly be happy to answer. But if you're pretty sure that the piece is classifies as American political thought, I don't think that that's going to be helpful to you. And I would say, I don't see people doing this very much, but I would be careful at, any journal, if it's clear that what you're writing is within the scope of what the journal publishes, that seems to me like you could just be sending somebody an unnecessary email, and nobody likes an unnecessary email. So really, I think I would only do it if you have an honest question about whether or not the material is appropriate for the journal.
I mean, is it not true that something like this happens at conferences or otherwise in an informal manner, or no?
Sure. Yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, I guess it's true. We don't have conferences where you can just run up to somebody and ask. So I don't mean to discourage people from asking, but that kind of question. But I don't think it's something that you should consider as part of standard practice.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but if your question is, does Tocqueville count?
Yeah.
Right. Or does John Locke count? Then email us.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
We have a question here. How does American political thought think about diversity among its authors? And I'll leave you to interpret what that might mean.
Well, I mean, as I suggested, diversity among authors and readers and reviewers is really important to us. But diversity by all sorts of metrics. We're talking about diversity in terms of scholarly rank, diversity in terms of discipline, diversity in terms of subfield. I would love to see more diversity in terms of gender and race in the journal, but I'm also, but when we get an article, it's blind and and the reviewers aren't going to know, and that's not it's something we hope to see, but I don't know if there's anything more I can say about that. We're trying to always get the sort of maximum number of voices and schools of thought and approaches to American political thought in any way we can conceive of those.
I'll say there are two concrete ways I can answer that question. One is the editorial board that we put together had some continuation from the prior board, but it was also conceived with respect to diversity in terms of rank, with diversity in terms of subfield, with diversity in terms of discipline, and in addition to other considerations. We do the same thing when we think of reviewers for a piece. And that we believe has a secondary function, that is to not only judge the merits of a piece, but also to advertise the journal, because these are gatekeepers in important areas. And the more they see this as a journal that is trying to get their input, the more it's going to expand its tent pegs.
Yeah, that's actually when I am choosing reviewers for a piece, I will try to seek out reviewers who have not reviewed for the journal before for that very purpose. Because I feel like if for every article we send out, there's one new reviewer, that's another person whose voice is being added indirectly into the journal. That's another person who knows about the journal. That's another person whose networks may, develop some connection with the journal. So that's one of the ways I think procedurally that we try to extend the range unless we're sort of by all sorts of metrics.
Here's another question. To what extent does your editorial board reflect what you are looking for? And now maybe you could even ask that as an author looking at finding a venue for your work, does the editorial board tell you something about the
I would say it's a incomplete attempt. There are people who turned us down. And so by definition, the board is not a platonic ideal.
Right.
And there were people who we spoke to for a variety of reasons who just said they were too busy. But I could think of, for example, I wish there were more people doing Puritan political thought on the board, for example.
Right.
But there's some other examples I can come up with in other ways as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to say is when we were coming up with revising the editorial board, we looked at the editorial boards of a lot of other journals. And it seems that a lot of journals have these wonkingly huge editorial boards, 80 or 100 people on them. And I think you'd be hard pressed in any of those cases to figure out what all those 80 or 100 people have in common. And I would hope that even with our board, which we tried to keep smaller just because it seemed like we just didn't want a kitchen sink approach to the editorial board. Even there, I think I would hope that you would look at the board of our journal and not be able to say, well, all of these people are X or Y or Z. We tried really hard to make it so that, in part because our aspirations for the journal is that the journal not be one school of thought or one disciplinary approach.
But at the same time, so it's diverse or broad, but at the same time, I would think that you get an indication about what the journal is about. All these people work on American political thought.
Political thought, right? Yeah.
So it's an advantage to have a kind of narrowness or to discriminate in that sense. There.
Tom, before you get to your next question, I've got a quick thing I wanted to mention, and it has to do with the contribution stuff, but we decided, and we haven't had any takers yet, but we're still very excited about this change, is that we've added a research note format to the submission process. And the research note would be peer-reviewed, but the idea is that it would be shorter, maybe 6,000 words, maybe even a little shorter than that. But it would primarily be to disseminate a research finding. So let's say that you've got something that you're sitting on. Say it's an archival discovery. Say it's an interpretive discovery. Say it's just a small piece, and you don't feel like you can go through the rigmarole of the framework of a contribution and all that, but you believe that other people, maybe even people outside your primary expertise, would find this of interest. And so,
are there other journals that other publications that have something akin to that?
Yeah, it's quite common in the quantitative.
Right.
So that's
another way of thinking about publication and research, instead of certainly among political theorists, but Americanists of various kinds, where you think you have to have a complete interpretation.
Right. I do think Jeremy and I are really excited about that, in part because I think we both think of our own piles of things we have where you say, wow, Ralph Ellison right there is quoting, Sigmund Freud in Totem and Taboo, and nobody's realized that before. Right. Boy, I bet scholars of Ellison and or Freud and or African-American political thought would make a lot of that. And maybe this could be helpful, but I don't want to do that work, or I can't do that work, or I'm not right. And so you can write a 5-page thing that says, here's what I found, here are some questions that this raises. And I would think that everybody has one or two things like that sitting, somewhere in their files that could be publishable.
Okay, yeah. So I guess we'll encourage people, if they have something like that they think might be appropriate, to send it along to you. Is there a separate form or something on your directions on the website about how to to.
I believe that when you're submitting, there's a drop-down menu where so you can select, are you submitting an article, a review, or a research note?
So I'm gonna just throw two more questions we have because we're running out of time, and respond to them to the extent you think you can. One is, how many of the copies of the journal, both paper and electronic, go out to readers? If you're willing to answer that. And another one about book publishing, which you are also involved in. After receiving a book, how do you make the decision to ask for a reviewer's? After you receive a book, how do you make the decision to ask for a book review? Sorry, this is still the journal. How do you choose the reviewer, and how long would it take? So book reviews.
I see Aileen's question there. Hi, Aileen.
Okay.
My colleague at the University of Houston. We have a book review editor, Nick Bucola. He handles all that.
Right.
One thing I would say very quickly about that is that the great variable there is on the reviewer's end. The people writing book reviews are famously slow with turning in book reviews.
And one thing you can do too is you could always write Nick or a book review editor at another journal and pitch a review article in which you would review 3 books, or even offer to review a specific book. That's something that is sort of out that you're totally, I would encourage people to do who might have an idea of that sort. As far as the number of copies question, I don't have recent numbers on that. But I do know that our journal, like most journals, gets most of its readership through services like JSTOR, right, on an article by article basis, rather than sort of full journal subscriptions. I believe that journal subscriptions have gone up slightly since Jeremy and I assumed editorship. This may be where coronavirus hits us and other journals in the near term, as university libraries are trying to cut budgets. But so far we haven't seen any evidence of that. I can't remember exactly what our sort of baseline number of issues was though, Jeremy.
It's also, we should mention it is the journal for the organized section of American Political Thought, the American Political Science Association. So when you pay your membership to that section, you get a subscription to the journal.
So we're nearly out of time, but I want to give you both a moment to give a final word or some final advice to folks who are interested to hear it.
One other thing I didn't think of is we see a surprising amount of articles which are more like, these are my reflections sitting by the fire on some event. Those don't belong typically in scholarly journals unless you're super duper famous. When you get super duper famous, we'll really want that submission, but until then, it probably belongs somewhere else.
I think that's right. I would just say, in general, the one piece of advice I would have is something I said before, especially for graduate students and younger scholars, to understand that even though we use a kind of bureaucratic software to manage this process, we are not a bureaucratic organization, and no journal is. And so even though the interaction can feel clunky and impersonal and bureaucratic, you should first of all remember that it's not in practice, and that if you do have questions or concerns, or if you want to have a bit more of a back and forth with an editor, especially once you get to a revise and resubmit stage, you should absolutely do that.
I second that.
Just one small follow-up on what you said. Is there a way to think about, I think you both have done some popular pieces like articles in popular journals, not in scholarly journals. How do you think about what belongs in one place or the other, or maybe the worth of doing such a thing career-wise?
Well, one thing, I can think of one example. If I'm going to write a popular piece about, say, Christopher Lasch, right?
Yeah.
Some of that article has to say, hey, here's who he was.
Right.
You are suffering with coronavirus. Here's how he might help you, right? Where I'm really trying to convince you that it's worth your time to even think about this person.
Right.
If I'm writing an article for a journal about Christopher Lasch, I don't have to convince readers of the journal that he's somebody who's worth paying attention to, right? If there's already a scholarly conversation out there, sometimes I think we see people using up a lot of spaces, convincing us that a topic is important, where the response is, anybody who's picking up our journal and starting this article about Walt Whitman is already convinced that Walt Whitman is somebody who's worth thinking about. So that's one of, I mean, I think that's one major difference in approach. If you're thinking about a kind of peer review versus popular journal approach. I'm sure Jeremy has more ideas.
No, that's great. That's perfect.
Okay, well, we've run out of time. I want to thank you both. I also want to say just a final word. Go to jackmillercenter.org if you want to see more of what we're up to. Feel free to contact us about how you think this went. If you have ideas for other webinars you think would be useful for you, I hope this was useful for you. And in particular, we won't be in APSA this year, but we're hoping to have some kind of virtual event. So if you have any ideas about what you think would be useful for us to do, send us a note and we'd be very interested to hear. And finally, thank you both for doing this. I think this was really useful for a lot of people. So thank you from the Jack Miller Center.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.